The anomaly showed up on a Tuesday, buried in 11 hours of hydrogen-line data that nobody else wanted to review. Dr. Maren Cole almost missed it. She had been running spectral decomposition on background field 7741 for 3 consecutive shifts at the Crane Deep Space Observatory, a converted mining platform bolted to the dark side of Callisto, where the electromagnetic interference from Jupiter's magnetosphere was someone else's problem, and the cold was very much hers. The heaters in Lab 4 had been failing intermittently for a week. Her coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. Her eyes ached from staring at waterfall plots that showed nothing but the galaxy breathing in its sleep. Then a line twitched. Not the kind of twitch that came from instrument drift or a microwave oven 3 corridors away. This was a narrowband spike at 1427.3 MHz, 12 MHz above the hydrogen line, sitting in the water hole like a stone someone had placed there on purpose. It lasted 11 seconds, vanished, and returned 43 seconds later with the same duration, the same amplitude, and a phase rotation that natural sources did not produce. Maren set down her stylus. Her hands were steady, but her pulse had climbed to somewhere in the low 90s, and she could feel it in her fingertips. She ran the calibration suite. The spike persisted. She switched to the backup receiver chain. The spike persisted. She pulled the raw voltage data from the front-end digitizer and examined it sample by sample, looking for the telltale sawtooth of a local oscillator leak or a reflection off the station's hull plating. Nothing. The signal was coming from outside. Her fingers hovered over the comm panel that would connect her to the watch commander upstairs. She pulled them back. 3 years ago, Maren Cole had been the lead signals analyst at the Array Cooperative on Ganymede when she'd flagged a repeating broadband pattern that turned out to be a faulty cryocooler on a Jovian weather satellite. The retraction had been public. The jokes in the break room had lasted longer than the signal. She transferred to Crane 6 months later, telling herself it was for the better baseline noise environment, knowing it was because she couldn't stand the way people looked at her when she said the word anomaly. She was not going to call this in until she was certain. Maren pulled up the antenna pointing log. Field 7741 was a survey target, a patch of apparently empty space between the constellations Lynx and Auriga as seen from Sol, roughly 400 light-years out, containing nothing of catalogued interest except a diffuse molecular cloud and 3 unremarkable M-dwarf stars. She cross-referenced the signal bearing with the station's ephemeris data. The source was consistent across 2 hours of Earth rotation compensation. It wasn't moving with the station. It wasn't geostationary relative to Jupiter. It was fixed against the stellar background, which meant it was far away, and it was real. The spike returned, 11 seconds on, 43 off, the same phase rotation. Then it changed. The off period shortened to 31 seconds. The on period stretched to 17. The amplitude doubled, and a secondary component appeared, a faint harmonic riding the primary carrier at exactly twice the frequency, carrying its own modulation. Maren stared at the waterfall plot as the harmonic bloomed and the pattern shifted again. 23 seconds on, 19 off. A third harmonic appeared. It was counting. Maren's breath caught. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the console, watching the timing intervals shift through a sequence that mapped with chilling precision to the first 8 prime numbers expressed in binary: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19. After 19, the signal paused for exactly 109 seconds, itself a prime, and started over. This time, the carrier frequency drifted upward by 0.07 MHz between each cycle. The harmonics tracked. The prime sequence repeated, but now each number was encoded twice, once in the timing intervals and once in the amplitude modulation. Redundancy. Deliberate redundancy, the kind a sender used when they didn't know if the receiver would understand timing or amplitude, so they sent both. Marin reached for the comm panel and stopped again. Her throat was dry. Her hands were shaking now, and she couldn't pretend it was the cold. She initiated a full Stokes polarimetric capture and began recording everything the antenna could see. Then she opened a fresh analysis workspace, labeled it FC7741, because she couldn't bring herself to write the words, and started building a decoder matrix. The prime sequence ran 6 more times. On the 7th iteration, it didn't repeat. Instead, the signal structure changed entirely. The timing intervals flattened to a steady pulse 1 second on, 1 second off, and the information shifted entirely to the amplitude domain. The carrier's power level varied between 8 discrete states, 8 levels, 3 bits per symbol. An octal encoding. Marin built the symbol map in 11 minutes. Each 3-bit group represented a value from 0 to 7. The values arrived in bursts of 8 symbols, separated by a distinctive null, a full second of silence that she'd started thinking of as a comma. 48 bits per burst, 6 bytes. The first decoded burst was 211235813. Fibonacci. Marin pressed her palms against her eyes and counted to 10. She removed her hands and looked at the numbers again. They hadn't changed. The signal was teaching her its language. It had started with primes to say, I am deliberate, I am not natural, and now it was offering Fibonacci to say, I understand sequences, I understand mathematical growth, I am building a vocabulary with you. She hit the comm panel. Watch Commander, Lab 4. I need you to seal this frequency band from all other station operations and route the backup antenna to the same coordinates. Do not ask me why on an open channel. A pause. Then Commander Tomas Breck's voice, calm and measured, the way a career Navy officer sounded when a civilian scientist used that tone at 3 in the morning. Dr. Cole, is this a hardware issue? No. Is there a safety concern? Not yet. Another pause. She could hear him deciding whether to push. Backup antenna slaved in 90 seconds. I'll seal the band. I'm coming down. Bring Dr. Akaffer. Adiz Akaffer was the station's computational linguist, assigned to Crane on a grant from the University of Lagos to study machine-assisted pattern recognition in astrophysical data. Marin had never spoken to her about anything more urgent than the mess hall schedule. And Commander, don't use the word signal in any communication until you're in this room. Breck arrived in 4 minutes. Akaffer arrived in 6, still pulling on her jacket, her dark eyes sharp with the particular alertness of someone who had been woken from deep sleep and told to move. They stood behind Marin's station and looked at the waterfall plot. That's not instrumentation, Breck said. No. And it's not a satellite. No. Akaffer leaned past both of them and touched the screen where the Fibonacci sequence scrolled in decoded octal. Her fingers traced the progression. How long has this been transmitting? I picked it up 3 hours ago. The archival data suggests it may have been present in previous survey sweeps of this field, but at a power level below our detection threshold. It's been getting louder. Getting closer, Akaffer corrected quietly. The 3 of them stood in silence. On the display, the signal evolved. The Fibonacci sequence ended. In its place came a new structure, pairs of numbers separated by the null comma, with a third number following each pair. The first trio was 1, 1, 2, then 1, 2, 3. Then 2, 3, 5. Addition, Akaffer said. It's teaching addition. It taught addition in 14 trios, then subtraction, then multiplication, then division expressed as ratios, then exponentiation. Each operation was presented with enough examples to be unambiguous, and each built on the vocabulary established by the previous one. The mathematical primer took 41 minutes, and by the end of it, Marin had a symbol table that could express any arithmetic operation the sender chose. Then the signal went silent. Breck exhaled. Is it over? No, Marin said. She was watching the noise floor. It's waiting. For what? For us to answer. The silence stretched. Marin felt it in her chest, a physical weight, as if the 400 light-years of void between the antenna and the source had collapsed into the 6 feet of air between her chair and the console. The signal had done everything it could. It had identified itself. It had proven intelligence. It had built a shared mathematical framework from nothing. And now it was pausing, the way a teacher pauses after writing a problem on the board. Your turn. Marin looked at Breck. I need authorization to transmit. Breck's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. The first was instinct, the military reflex to lock down, report up the chain, wait for guidance from someone with more stars on their shoulders. The second was calculation, the recognition that the nearest authority with jurisdiction over a first contact scenario was on Earth, 43 light-minutes away, and that any request for permission would take an hour-and-a-half round trip before the question even reached someone who could answer it. The third was something Marin had never seen on his face before. Fear, maybe, or wonder, or both, braided together so tightly that his body couldn't decide which one to express. What would you send? He asked. Marin turned to Akafur. The linguist had been writing on a tablet, her stylus moving in quick, precise strokes. She held it up. On the screen was a simple sequence: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. Primes, the next prime after the sender's sequence. An answer and an extension. I heard you. I understood. Here is the next one. Send it, Breck said. Marin's hands moved across the console. She configured the transmitter to match the sender's parameters, same frequency, same bandwidth, same octal encoding, same null comma delimiter. She loaded Akafur's sequence and transmitted it in a 10-second burst, then repeated it 3 times with the same timing pattern the sender had used. The signal came back in 19 seconds. Not a repetition, not an echo, a new sequence. The sender repeated Marin's prime 23 and followed it with a burst that used the arithmetic vocabulary it had already established. The burst decoded as 23 plus 6 equals 29. The next prime expressed as a relationship to the one Marin had sent. I see your 23. I know what comes after it, and I know how to get there. Akafur made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It's collaborating. It heard us, and it's building on what we said. The exchange accelerated. Each round added complexity. The sender introduced variables, placeholders for unknown values that it defined through context, the way a language teacher might point to an object and say the word 3 times. Marin and Akafur responded in kind, extending each concept, testing boundaries, making deliberate errors to see if the sender would correct them. It did every time, and each correction was gentle, a repetition of the correct form alongside the error, with no admonishment, no wasted symbols, just clarity. By the 4th hour, they had a working symbolic language with arithmetic, basic algebra, and a rudimentary system of logical operators. By the 6th hour, the sender had introduced a concept that Marin spent 20 minutes decoding before she understood it. A symbol that meant I do not know. A variable that represented uncertainty itself, offered freely, without shame. That's not a mathematical concept, Akafur said, her voice hoarse. She had been talking almost continuously, narrating her analysis into a recorder that Breck had started running at hour 2. That's a philosophical one. It's telling us it has limits. It's telling us it's willing to admit what it doesn't understand. Breck had been silent for a long time, standing behind them with his arms crossed, watching the data scroll. Now he spoke. What does it want? Right now, to talk. Marin pulled up the transmission log. It hasn't asked for coordinates. It hasn't requested identification. It hasn't sent anything that could be interpreted as a demand or a threat. Everything it's sent has been instructional. It's teaching us how to talk to it, and it's learning how we respond. And it's getting closer. Marin checked the signal strength curve. She'd been monitoring it passively, letting the power level trend tell her what the range data couldn't. It's been increasing in strength at a rate consistent with a source closing at approximately 4% of light speed. Given the initial distance estimate, that puts arrival in the inner system in roughly 18 days. The number landed in the room like a dropped tool. 18 days, Breck repeated. Give or take. The deceleration profile isn't constant, it's been adjusting in ways I don't fully understand. But the trend is clear. Whatever this is, it's coming here. Breck uncrossed his arms. I need to make a call. He stepped to the comm panel and initiated a priority link to Fleet Command on Ceres. Marin listened to the authentication sequence, 3 layers of cipher, each one escalating the classification level. And then Breck was talking to someone whose voice she couldn't hear, delivering a report in the flat, deliberate cadence of a man who had trained for decades to describe the impossible without editorializing. While he talked, the signal changed again. It was Akafer who noticed. Marin, look at this. The symbolic language had been entirely mathematical until now: numbers, operators, variables, logical connectives. Clean. Abstract. The kind of communication 2 intelligences could build from nothing because mathematics was universal. But the new burst contained something different, a structure that didn't map to any operation in their shared vocabulary. It arrived as a complex nested expression: operators within operators, variables referencing other variables in recursive loops that seemed to fold back on themselves. Marin ran it through the decoder. The output was gibberish. She tried rearranging the nesting order, still gibberish. She tried treating the outer layer as metadata, a description of how to read the inner layer, and the inner layer as payload. The inner layer decoded as a grid, 16 by 16, 256 cells, each containing a value from 0 to 7. When she mapped the values to brightness levels and displayed them as an image, the grid resolved into a shape. A circle. Rough, pixelated at this resolution, but unmistakable. A perfect circle, drawn in arithmetic, transmitted across 400 light-years of void. It's sending pictures, Marin whispered. The next grid arrived 90 seconds later. This one showed 2 circles, one larger, one smaller, the smaller one orbiting the larger at a fixed distance. A planet around a star. The third grid added a second orbiting body. The fourth added a third. By the 8th transmission, the grid showed a complete system, a star with 6 worlds, each at a different orbital radius, each represented by a circle of proportional size. Their home system, Akafer breathed. They're showing us where they come from. The 9th grid was different. It showed the same system, but one of the middle worlds, the 4th from the star, had a marking on it. A small cluster of higher value cells concentrated on one hemisphere. Marin stared at it. Cities, she said, or settlements, something on the surface dense enough to be worth pointing out. The 10th grid zoomed in. The planet filled the frame, and the surface markings resolved into dozens of clusters scattered across 2 continents. One cluster was circled, the same recursive operator structure the sender had used to frame the image format itself. Look here. This one matters. The 11th grid showed a shape Marin didn't recognize. It wasn't a circle. It wasn't geometric at all. It was irregular, asymmetric, with protrusions at odd angles and a dense concentration of high-value cells in its center. It took her a full minute to understand what she was looking at. A body, a living thing, rendered in a 16 by 16 grid with all the fidelity that resolution allowed. The protrusions were limbs, 6 of them, radiating from a central mass. The central cluster was a head or a sensory node or whatever served that function. It was showing her what it looked like. 6 limbs, Akafer said, leaning over Marin's shoulder. Radial symmetry, no bilateral axis. That's not just alien physiology, that's a fundamentally different body plan from anything Earth produced. The 12th grid showed two of the beings. They were oriented toward each other, their limbs interleaved in a pattern that suggested interaction, communication, cooperation, some form of social bonding. One of them had a symbol hovering above it, the uncertainty variable. I do not know. It was asking a question. Marin understood before Akafar did. The being with the uncertainty symbol wasn't saying, I don't know what I am. It was saying, I don't know what you are. Show me. It wants to see us, Marin said. Breck had finished his call. He was standing behind them again, his face unreadable. Fleet Command is sending a contact protocol team from Ceres. ETA 9 days. Until then, we are authorized to continue passive observation and limited two-way exchange at your discretion, Dr. Cole. The authorization comes with one condition. He paused. Do not transmit any data that reveals Earth's location, population, military capability, or defensive posture. Marin nodded. She turned back to the console and looked at the grid with its two six-limbed figures and its hovering question mark. She opened a new transmission buffer, built a 16 by 16 grid, drew a circle crude the same resolution as the senders, then a smaller circle at the top, a vertical line for a torso, 2 lines for arms, 2 lines for legs, a stick figure, the most primitive possible representation of a human being, stripped of every detail except bilateral symmetry and upright posture. She transmitted it. The response came in 37 seconds. The sender had taken her stick figure and done something extraordinary with it. It had replicated her image alongside its own six-limbed self-portrait in a single grid, the two figures oriented toward each other in the same interleaved posture it had used to show two of its own kind communicating. Beneath both figures, it had placed the arithmetic symbol for equality. You and me, the same. Marin's eyes burned. She pressed her palms against them again, harder this time, because she was a scientist and scientists didn't cry at data, except this wasn't data anymore. This was a hand reaching across 400 light-years of absolute darkness, and saying I see you and you are like me, even though everything about their bodies, their senses, their entire evolutionary history said the opposite. Dr. Cole, Breck's voice was quiet. What did it say? It said we're the same. The next 11 days were the longest and shortest of Marin's life. The symbolic language grew exponentially. What had started as arithmetic became algebra, then geometry, then a rudimentary physics. The sender transmitted values for fundamental constants, and Marin and Akafar spent a harrowing afternoon confirming that the speed of light, the gravitational constant and Planck's constant were identical to the ones humanity had measured. Same universe, same rules. Different hands building different tools from the same raw materials. On day 2, Marin tried to introduce the concept of color. She built a symbolic framework, wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation mapped to the visible spectrum, each frequency assigned a numerical label. The sender absorbed the framework in under a minute. Then it responded with something that stopped Marin cold. It had extended her visible spectrum past both ends, deep into the ultraviolet and far into the infrared, and populated the extensions with over 40 additional labels, each carrying the same semantic weight as Marin's original 7. They could see frequencies humanity couldn't. The world they inhabited was painted in colors Marin had no names for. That's not just a sensory difference, Akafar said, studying the extended chart. That's a cognitive one. If their visual range is that broad, their spatial reasoning, their art, their emotional associations with color, all of it operates in a domain we literally cannot perceive. We're deaf to half their world. And they know it. Marin pointed to the transmission. At the boundary between her labeled range and the sender's extensions, it had placed the uncertainty variable. I know you cannot see these. I am showing you anyway. On day 3, the sender introduced a concept that broke Achafer's existing decoder framework and required 12 hours to reconstruct. It was a temporal operator, a way of expressing past, present, and future within the symbolic language. Not tense in the grammatical sense, tense in the existential sense. This happened, this is happening, this will happen, and embedded within the temporal framework a conditional, this might happen. On day 4, the sender used the temporal operators to tell a story. It was simple, crude, constrained by the vocabulary they shared, but unmistakable in its structure. Once we were on our world, then something happened to our world. Now we are not on our world, we are moving. They're refugees, Achafer said, and her voice cracked on the word. They're not explorers, they're not invaders. They left their home and they're looking for somewhere to go. Marin studied the transmission. The temporal sequence included the uncertainty variable in the future tense position. We do not know what will happen. We do not know where we are going. They're lost, Marin said. Not lost, displaced. There's a difference. Achafer pulled up the orbital diagram from day 1. They showed us a system with 6 worlds. If one of those worlds became uninhabitable, ecological collapse, stellar event, war, a species with interstellar capability might have no choice but to move. A species with interstellar capability that chose to announce itself with prime numbers and Fibonacci and stick figures, Marin said. Not with weapons, not with demands, with mathematics. Late on day 4, while Achafer slept and Breck stood watch, the sender did something Marin didn't expect. It transmitted a burst that contained no new vocabulary, no new grammar, no puzzle to solve. Just a repetition of the equality symbol, the one from the stick figure exchange, followed by the uncertainty variable. Followed by a compound symbol, Marin had to build a new decoder branch to interpret. It translated roughly as, "Are we still the same?" Marin sat with that for a long time. The question wasn't rhetorical. The sender had spent 4 days revealing the depth of its alienness, the radial symmetry, the color spectrum beyond human perception, the cognitive architecture that absorbed frameworks wholesale. With each revelation, the gap between the two species widened. And now it was asking, across that widening gap, whether the thing they had felt when they first exchanged stick figures still held. Whether being different was the same as being unequal. Marin transmitted back the equality symbol, unmodified, with no uncertainty variable. The sender's response was a single pulse of the carrier, 1 second on, 1 second off, the same rhythm it had used in the very first transmission. The beginning of everything, repeated, an acknowledgement that didn't need words. On day 5, the contact protocol team's advanced communications began arriving from the task force en route from Ceres. Captain Alara Vasic transmitted a classified briefing packet that included contact protocols, linguistic exchange frameworks, and a set of rules that Marin read with growing unease. The rules treated the approaching entity as a potential threat. The language was careful assessment posture, defensive readiness, containment contingencies. Marin understood the logic. A species capable of interstellar travel was, by definition, capable of destroying anything that couldn't travel between stars. The power differential was real, and pretending it wasn't would be negligent. But the rules didn't account for what Marin had been living inside for 5 days. The patience of the transmissions, the gentleness of the corrections, the symbol for uncertainty offered without shame, the stick figure and the 6-limbed body placed side by side under an equal sign. On day 6, the sender transmitted something that took Marin 2 days to decode. It arrived as a dense block of symbols, thousands of them, nested in recursive layers that made the earlier image format look like a child's drawing. Achafer's pattern recognition algorithms couldn't crack it. Marin's brute force frequency analysis couldn't crack it. They worked in shifts, sleeping in 4-hour blocks on cots Breck had set up in the corridor outside Lab 4. eating ration bars without tasting them, talking to each other in the shorthand that develops between two people who have been staring at the same problem for too long. On day 8, at 3 in the morning again, Marin was beginning to suspect the universe had a sense of humor about that hour she found the key. The dense block wasn't a single message. It was a dictionary. The sender had taken every concept they had established together, every number, every operator, every logical connective, every temporal marker, every image, and organized them into a structured reference document. Categories, subcategories, cross-references between related concepts, an index. It was building a language, not a code, not a cipher, a language with grammar and syntax and semantic relationships designed from the ground up to be learnable by a species that thought in completely different categories. And embedded in the dictionary, in a section that cross-referenced the temporal operators with the uncertainty variable, was a word. Marin stared at it for a long time. It was a new symbol, one she hadn't seen before, defined through its relationships to 3 existing concepts. It connected the past tense marker, the concept of place, and the uncertainty variable in a specific configuration that Okafor confirmed could only mean one thing. Home that was, place that is no longer. They had a word for lost home. They had built their dictionary around it. Marin sat at her console and cried silently in the blue light of the waterfall display, while the signal pulsed its quiet, patient rhythm from 400 light-years away, and the coffee went cold again. On day 9, the task force arrived. Captain Vasic was younger than Marin expected, mid-40s, with close-cropped silver hair and the controlled stillness of someone who had commanded warships. She brought 12 people, linguists, physicists, a xenobiologist, 2 intelligence analysts, and a Marine lieutenant who stood near the door and didn't speak. They filled Lab 4 until there was barely room to turn around, and they smelled like recycled air and transit coffee. Vasic listened to Marin's briefing without interruption. She watched the transmission log scroll. She studied the dictionary. She looked at the 16 by 16 grids, the star system, the planet, the 6-limbed figures, the equality symbol. "How certain are you," she said, "that this isn't a lure?" Marin had been expecting the question. "You mean, is the mathematical primer a standardized first contact package designed to establish trust before a hostile approach?" "That is what I mean. I can't prove it isn't. No one can prove a negative, but I can tell you 3 things. First, the signal has been decelerating consistently for 18 days, which means whoever is aboard has been slowing down since before we detected them. That's not the profile of an attack run. Second, every communication has been instructional and collaborative. They correct our errors, they build on our responses, and they introduced an uncertainty operator before they introduced anything else. An entity planning deception doesn't teach you the word for I don't know. Third," Marin paused. "Third, they have a word for lost home. They built their dictionary around it. I've spent 10 days inside this signal, Captain. It's not a lure, it's a letter." Vasic's expression didn't change. "What do they want?" "Contact. That's all they've asked for. They want to see us and they want us to see them. And if what we see is a warship, then we deal with that. But the signal hasn't lied to us yet, and I don't think it will." Vasic studied her for a long moment. Then she turned to Breck. "Commander, I'm going to move the Kessler to a position 200,000 kilometers ahead of the station, on the incoming bearing. Full defensive posture, weapons cold but ready. Dr. Cole continues the exchange from here with full access to our communications suite. If the entity's behavior changes, any change that suggests hostile intent, I want to know before Dr. Cole does." "Understood." "Dr. Cole," Vasic looked at her again, "I read your file, the Ganymede incident. You flagged something that turned out to be a cryocooler, and your professional reputation took a hit." Marin felt heat rise in her face. "Yes. This one isn't a cryocooler. No, no, it isn't. Vasik's expression softened barely, the way steel softens when the furnace temperature rises by 1 degree. Continue your work. The task force is here to provide cover, not to take over. You are the primary contact operator until I say otherwise. Marin swallowed. Thank you, Captain. Vasik turned to leave. At the door she paused. Dr. Cole. The word they built their dictionary around. The one for lost home. Yes. Make sure we don't give them a reason to need another one. On day 10, one of the intelligence analysts, a thin man named Corbin with pale eyes and the habit of standing too close to screens, requested access to the transmission logs. Marin granted it. 2 hours later, he came back with a tablet full of notes and an expression she recognized. The look of someone who had found a pattern and wasn't sure he liked it. The mathematical primer, he said. The one they sent on the first night. I've been running it through cryptographic analysis frameworks. It's not encrypted, it's a teaching tool. I know what it looks like. I'm telling you what else it might be. He held up the tablet. The primer establishes a shared symbol table, yes, but the specific sequence of operations, the order in which they introduced concepts, the progression from primes to Fibonacci to arithmetic to algebra, that sequence also maps to a probe. Each step tests a different cognitive capacity: pattern recognition, symbolic abstraction, contextual inference, error correction. You're saying they were testing us? I'm saying the primer is structured to assess the receiver's intelligence level based on response latency and accuracy. They weren't just teaching us their language. They were measuring how fast we learned it. Marin stared at him. The room was quiet. Akefer had stopped typing. And Marin said. Corbin looked at his tablet. And based on our response times, they now have a fairly precise estimate of human cognitive processing speed, learning rate, and capacity for symbolic abstraction. He paused. They know exactly how smart we are. The room absorbed that. Marin thought about every delayed response, every error she and Akefer had made, every moment of confusion they'd worked through in real time. All of it observed, all of it measured. Not maliciously, the primer had been genuine, the teaching real, but the data collection had been embedded in the pedagogy, invisible, elegant, and complete. That doesn't change anything, Marin said. We knew they were intelligent. Now they know we're intelligent. That's the point of first contact. Corbin started to respond. Vasik, who had been listening from the corridor, stepped into the doorway. Mr. Corbin, your analysis is noted and logged. Dr. Cole continues the exchange. Her tone carried the particular finality of a woman who had ended conversations with admirals. Corbin closed his tablet and left. On day 12, the sender transmitted something playful. It sent the Fibonacci sequence again, the same one from the first night, but this time, at the end, it appended a new number that broke the pattern. The next value should have been 21. The sender wrote 22. Marin stared at it, checked it again. Then she understood. It was a joke, a mathematical joke. The sender had made a deliberate error, the same kind of deliberate error Marin and Akefer had used on day 1 to test the sender's correction behavior, and it was waiting to see if Marin would correct it. She sent back, 22 minus 1 equals 21. The correct value, delivered through the shared arithmetic, with the sender's own pedagogical patience turned back on itself. The response was the equality symbol repeated 3 times. In the shared language, repetition served no grammatical purpose. The meaning was already complete in one symbol. Repeating it 3 times was redundant, unnecessary, decorative. It was laughing. Akefer leaned back in her chair and pressed both hands against her mouth, her eyes shining above her fingers. They have humor. They have actual humor. A species with radial symmetry and 6 limbs and a visual spectrum we can't see, and they make jokes. Day 13. The entity was close enough for optical resolution. The Kessler's long-range telescopes captured it against the backdrop of the outer system's darkness, a shape that didn't belong to any human classification guide. It was massive. Marin's initial estimates put it at roughly 2 kilometers along its longest axis, and its geometry defied the clean lines of human engineering. No bilateral symmetry, no obvious boat-astern orientation. It was a cluster of interconnected modules, some spherical, some cylindrical, some shapes Marin didn't have words for, linked by conduits and structural trusses that gave the whole assembly the appearance of a living thing, a deep-sea organism, perhaps, or a coral formation grown in zero gravity over decades or centuries. It was not a warship. Warships were built for function. This was built for endurance, for survival, for carrying something precious across a distance so vast that the ship itself had become the world. There are heat signatures consistent with biological habitation across 60% of the structure, the Kessler's sensor officer reported. Multiple atmospheric compositions, nitrogen, oxygen in some modules, methane, argon in others. Electromagnetic emissions from the hull suggest active internal power generation. And we're picking up the signal directly now. It's originating from a module near the geometric center of the assembly. How many? Vasek asked. How many what, Captain? How many of them are aboard? A pause. Based on heat distribution and the number of habitable modules, the xenobiology team estimates between 8,000 and 12,000 individuals. Marin closed her eyes. 12,000 people in a ship made of pieces, crossing 400 light-years of nothing, sending prime numbers into the dark because they had nowhere else to go. Vasek studied the telescope feed for a long time. The cluster ship rotated slowly on the screen, its modules catching the distant sun's light and releasing it in iridescent pulses that looked, from this distance, like breathing. It's not armed, Vasek said finally. Her voice carried something Marin hadn't heard from her before, not softness exactly, but the particular quality of a military officer recalibrating a threat assessment downward and discovering that the absence of threat was more unsettling than the presence of one. No weapons arrays, no targeting sensors, no defensive emplacements. Nothing on that hull is designed to harm anything. No, Marin said, it's designed to keep things alive. The intelligence analyst, Corbin, had been studying the structural analysis feed. He looked up. The habitat modules are pressurized to different atmospheric compositions, some nitrogen-oxygen, some methane-argon, some with gas mixes we don't have names for. Akafor leaned forward. Multiple species, or multiple biological casts of the same species, each requiring different environmental conditions. Corbin scrolled through the data. The methane-argon modules are concentrated near the core. The nitrogen-oxygen modules are on the periphery, closer to the hull. If I had to guess, I'd say the core population is the original species, and the peripheral modules were added later, adapted or grown to accommodate a different atmosphere. Grown to accommodate us, Marin said quietly. The room went still. You don't know that, Corbin said. No. But the nitrogen-oxygen modules are the newest structures on the ship. The hull growth around them is lighter, less scarred, less weathered. They were added recently within the last few decades, based on the micrometeorite erosion patterns. She looked at Vasek. They've been building rooms for us, before they even knew if we existed. Vasek said nothing for a long count. Then she turned back to the telescope feed. Or they've been building rooms for anyone, any species with a compatible atmosphere, anyone who might answer their signal. Yes, Marin said, anyone. On day 14, the sender's transmissions shifted to real-time exchange. The delay had shrunk to under a second. The entity was inside the orbit of Neptune, decelerating hard, its cluster of modules rotating slowly as it bled off velocity. Marin and Akafor had been joined by 2 linguists from the task force, and the 4 of them worked in overlapping shifts, maintaining continuous dialogue. The real-time shift changed everything. The exchange had been asynchronous until now: send a message, wait for the lightspeed delay, receive the response, decode, respond. That rhythm had a built-in breathing room, a pause for thought between each volley. Now the pauses vanished. The sender was right there, responding in fractions of a second, and the conversation acquired a momentum that Marin felt in her spine. It was like the difference between passing notes in class and sitting across a table from someone. The dictionary had grown to 1,100 concepts. The sender was learning English, or its symbolic equivalent, with a speed that Akaffer described as structurally impossible for a human analog brain. "They're not learning the way we do," she explained to Vasek during the daily briefing. "They don't acquire vocabulary word by word. They acquire frameworks. They absorb the logical structure of a concept category, spatial relationships, temporal markers, social roles, and then fill in the individual terms almost instantly. It's like they learn the grammar first, and the vocabulary falls into place." "How fast?" "At the current rate, we'll have a working conversational language within 48 hours. Full technical and abstract vocabulary within a week." Vasek absorbed this. Can they understand the concept of a border, territory, a place that belongs to someone? Akaffer hesitated. They have a concept of place. They have a concept of belonging. Whether those map to sovereignty in the way we mean it, I'm not sure yet. "Find out." Marin found out on day 15. She had been working on the sender's concept of community, the way they described relationships between individuals, when she encountered a structure she couldn't parse. It used the temporal operators, the uncertainty variable, and a new modifier she hadn't seen before. She spent 2 hours on it before Akaffer, looking over her shoulder, said quietly, "It's a pronoun." "We already have pronouns. I, you, the sender, the receiver." "No, this is different. This is we who were. A pronoun for a collective self that existed in the past but no longer exists in the same form." Akaffer sat down heavily. "They don't just have a word for lost home. They have a pronoun for lost people, a grammatical form for the members of their community who didn't make it." Marin looked at the symbol on her screen. It was small 3 operators nested around the first-person plural marker, modified by the past tense and the negation. We who were. The ones who are gone. She thought about 12,000 individuals in a ship made of salvage, crossing the void with a dictionary that included a pronoun for the dead. "They lost people," she said. "A lot of people. The pronoun isn't rare. It shows up in every transmission block that references their home or their journey. It's woven into the language the way articles are woven into English. They don't say we left. They say we who remain left." On day 16, at Vasek's request, Marin transmitted a question. She built it carefully in the shared symbolic language, reviewed it with Akaffer and both task force linguists, and sent it with the precision of someone handling a detonator. The question was, what happened to your world? The answer took 4 hours. Not because it was short, but because the sender composed it with the same care Marin had used for the question. When the full response arrived and Marin ran it through the decoder, the translation filled her screen. "Our star grew sick. The light changed. The world that fed us could not feed us. We built what we could carry. We carried who we could save. The rest stayed. We who remain do not know if the rest survived. We sent signals to them for 130 years. No answer came." Marin read the translation aloud to the room. No one spoke for a long time. Commander Breck, who had been present for every one of the 16 days, who had watched from behind Marin's chair, as the mathematics became arithmetic, and the arithmetic became language, and the language became a conversation, cleared his throat. "They've been traveling for over 130 years. At least, the temporal framework suggests it could be significantly longer. They don't measure time the way we do. Their units are based on biological cycles, not orbital periods. But the scale is clear. Multiple generations have lived and died aboard that ship. Born in transit, Breck said. Some of the people aboard have never known anything but the inside of that vessel. Yes. Breck was quiet for a moment. He had been the constant in the room, the anchor Marin hadn't known she needed. He hadn't tried to take over the exchange. He hadn't second-guessed her transmissions. He'd sealed the frequency band, brought Akafor, set up cots, started a recorder, and stood behind them for 16 days while two women rewrote the definition of what it meant to be alone in the universe. My grandfather was a refugee, Breck said. He didn't look at Marin. He looked at the decoded message still scrolling on the display. Left a place that couldn't sustain him anymore. Crossed water instead of vacuum, but the math is the same. You carry what you can. You leave behind what you can't. And the whole way, you keep sending signals into the dark, hoping someone on the other side is listening. Marin didn't respond. There was nothing to add. On the display, the sender's transmission pulsed once the equality symbol, unmodified, unsolicited, and Marin wondered, not for the first time, whether the sender could hear their conversations through the audio components of the station's transmissions. Whether the carrier wave leaked enough to carry the sound of a man talking about his grandfather to a species that had never known grandfathers. Day 17. The entity was inside the orbit of Mars, decelerating into a long elliptical approach that the Kessler's navigation team confirmed would bring it to a relative stop approximately 400,000 kilometers from Callisto in 2 days. Close enough to see each other's running lights. Close enough, in the cold logic of military planning, for either side to kill the other. Vasek had positioned the Kessler on a parallel course, matching the entity's deceleration, maintaining a constant distance of 200,000 kilometers. Her weapons remained cold. The Marine lieutenant still stood near the door of Lab 4 and still didn't speak. The sender transmitted an image. Not a 16 by 16 grid this time. The symbolic language had grown sophisticated enough to support higher resolution data compression, and what arrived was a 512 by 512 image, a photograph, or its alien equivalent, rendered in 256 grayscale values. It showed the interior of a module. The walls were curved, organic, lined with something that might have been a biological growth or an engineered material that mimicked one. Light came from bioluminescent strips along the ceiling, and in the center of the frame, arranged in a loose cluster, were 7 beings. 6 limbs each, radial symmetry, bodies that tapered from a wide base to a narrow sensory cluster at the top. Their limbs were jointed in 3 places and ended in structures that could have been hands or feet or both. Their surfaces were textured, not skin in the human sense, but something layered, like bark or chitin, with variations in shade that Akafor immediately identified as potential chromatic communication. They were looking at the camera, all 7 of them, oriented toward the lens with the focused attention of beings who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The image carried a caption in the symbolic language, "We who remain, this is what we are." Marin stared at the image until the shapes blurred. Then she made a decision. She pulled up the station's internal camera system, selected the feed from Lab 4, adjusted the angle until it showed the room, the consoles, the waterfall displays, the cots in the corridor visible through the open door, the cold coffee, the scattered tablets, and in the center of the frame 4 humans. Herself, pale and exhausted and still wearing the same jacket she'd put on 17 days ago. Akafor, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, her recorder still running. Breck, gray-templed and steady, his uniform rumpled for the first time since Marin had known him. And behind them, visible in the doorway, the Marine lieutenant, who had stood watch for 9 days without being asked. Marin captured the image, downsampled it to 512 by 512, converted it to the sender's grayscale format, added a caption, "We who are here. This is what we are." She transmitted it. The response took 3 minutes. When it arrived, Akefer decoded it and read it aloud, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "4 of you, 7 of us. We are fewer than we were. You are fewer than you will be. The shapes are different. The signal is the same." Marin put her face in her hands. On day 18, with the entity holding station 400,000 kilometers from Callisto and the Kessler holding watch between them, Captain Vasek came to Lab 4. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room that had become the center of the most significant event in human history. The cables strewn across the floor, the half-eaten ration bars, the waterfall display still scrolling, still pulsing with the quiet rhythm of the signal that had started as a twitch in the hydrogen line and become a bridge between two species that had never dreamed of each other. "Dr. Cole," she said, "they're requesting something." Marin looked up. "I know, I just decoded it." The request was simple, expressed in the shared language with the precision of beings who understood that this moment would define every moment after it. It was 3 symbols long. The first symbol was the sender's word for space, not outer space, but the concept of an area between two things, a gap, a threshold. The second symbol was their word for together, the same operator they had used in the image caption, the one that linked 7 of us with 4 of you. The third symbol was a new construction. It combined the present tense marker, the first person plural, both pronouns theirs and ours, merged into a single compound form that hadn't existed in the language until this transmission, and the uncertainty variable. Together the 3 symbols read, "A place where we and you stand, not knowing." They were asking for a meeting point, a neutral space where both sides could come together, knowing nothing about what would happen next, accepting that uncertainty as the price of beginning. Vasek looked at Marin. "What do you recommend?" Marin thought about the cryocooler on Ganymede, the retraction, the jokes, the transfer to a mining platform on the dark side of Callisto, where the cold was her problem and the galaxy was supposed to be quiet. She thought about prime numbers in the water hole, Fibonacci, a circle drawn in arithmetic, a stick figure and a 6-limbed body under an equals sign, we who remain, lost home, the pronoun for the dead. "I recommend we say yes." Vasek held her gaze for a long count of 5. Then she nodded once. "Transmit the following. Coordinates for a point equidistant between the Kessler and the entity. Standard approach velocity. No weapons. 1 vessel from each side. And Dr. Cole." "Yes." "You're on the shuttle." Marin's stomach dropped. "Captain, I'm a radio astronomer. I analyze signals, I don't." "You've been talking to them for 18 days. You built the language they're speaking. You sent them a picture of a stick figure and they sent back the word for equality. You're the closest thing we have to someone they know." Vasek's voice was quiet but absolute. "You are on the shuttle." Marin didn't sleep that night. She sat at her console and watched the signal pulse, the rhythm she had learned to read the way a cardiologist reads a heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, the one who had flinched at the word anomaly, the one who had transferred to the coldest assignment in the system, because the alternative was enduring the pity of colleagues who had stopped believing she could tell the difference between a cryocooler and a miracle. She thought about the dictionary, about the word for lost home, about the pronoun for the dead, about a species that crossed 400 light years with the word for I don't know at the center of its vocabulary, and a sense of humor embedded in its Fibonacci sequences. She thought about the fact that in 18 days she hadn't once doubted what the signal was, not once. The woman who had flinched at anomaly had listened to prime numbers climbing out of the noise floor at 3 in the morning on a mining platform in the shadow of Jupiter, and she had known, not believed, not hoped, known. Some signals you recognize the way you recognize your own voice in a recording, unfamiliar at first, then undeniable. 22 hours later, Marin Cole sat in the co-pilot seat of a Terran short-range shuttle, wearing a pressure suit she'd been fitted for that morning, watching through the forward viewport as the entity's meeting vessel approached from the opposite direction. The shuttle was small, 4 seats, minimal instrumentation, no weapons. Breck was piloting, his hands steady on the controls, his jaw set in the expression of a man who had accepted that the next hour would either justify or destroy everything he'd ever trained for. Behind them, Akafer sat with a portable translation terminal on her lap, running real-time decoding on the signal that still pulsed between the entity and the station, quieter now, as if the sender knew that words were about to become unnecessary. The entity's vessel was smaller than Marin had expected. A single module, detached from the main cluster, roughly the size of the shuttle. It was moving at the same velocity, on a reciprocal course, closing the distance with the mathematical precision of a species that expressed meeting as an equation. At 1,000 kilometers, both vessels stopped. Marin watched the ranging display count down the distance. 1,000 kilometers. In the scale of space, it was nothing a rounding error, a decimal place, the width of a hair on a map of the galaxy. But in the scale of 2 species meeting for the first time, it was the width of the universe. Everything that had happened, the prime numbers, the Fibonacci, the circle drawn in arithmetic, the word for lost home, the pronoun for the dead, all of it had been preparation for crossing this last distance. And now both vessels hung motionless in the void, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "They're scanning us," Breck said, his eyes on the instruments. "Passive sensors only, no targeting systems. They're looking, not locking." "We're scanning them too," Marin said. "Fair point." At 500 they resumed slower. At 100, Marin could see the vessel through the viewport. Up close, the organic geometry was even more striking. The hull wasn't metal or ceramic. It was grown. Layers of something that refracted the distant sun's light in shimmering patterns, like nacre, like the inside of a shell. It was beautiful. At 50 kilometers, the signal changed for the last time. A single symbol. Marin didn't need the decoder. She had lived inside this language for 18 days, dreamed in its symbols, felt its rhythms in the way she felt her own heartbeat. She knew this symbol the way she knew her own name. It was the compound pronoun, the one the sender had invented 3 days ago, the one that merged their first-person plural with ours into a form that hadn't existed before because the concept it described, a we that included both species, both histories, both sets of dead and both sets of living, hadn't existed before. We. Not them and us. Not sender and receiver. Not the 6-limbed beings who had crossed 400 light-years with a pronoun for their dead, and the bilateral bipeds who had answered their prime numbers with the next number in the sequence. We. At 10 kilometers, the 2 vessels matched velocity and drifted together, separated by nothing but vacuum and the last thin membrane of the unknown. Marin unstrapped from her seat. Her hands were shaking. Her heart rate was somewhere north of 120, and the pressure suit's biometric display was flashing amber warnings she ignored. She moved to the shuttle's airlock and looked through the porthole. The entity's vessel had extended a docking collar, or grown one. It was hard to tell. It was reaching toward the shuttle the way a hand reaches across a table. Slowly, gently, with the kind of care that comes from knowing you might break what you're trying to touch. "Collar is compatible," Breck reported from the cockpit, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man whose instruments were telling him something his training hadn't prepared him for. "Pressure equalization in progress. Atmosphere on the other side reads nitrogen-oxygen, 21% O2, traces of methane. Breathable." Marin looked at Akafer. The linguist's eyes were wet, but she was smiling the fierce, unreserved smile of someone who had spent her career studying how meaning traveled between minds, and was about to watch it happen with her own eyes. The signal is still transmitting, Akafor said. One symbol repeating. Which one? The one for home. But modified, present tense. Not lost home, not home that was. She paused. Home that might be. The airlock cycled. The inner door opened. Beyond it, a short corridor of nacre-bright walls, warm and faintly luminous, smelling of something Marin couldn't name, mineral and alive, like wet stone in sunlight. At the far end, another door. And beyond that door, visible through a transparent panel, a figure. 6 limbs, radial symmetry, textured surface shifting through shades of gray and amber in patterns Marin knew were speech or emotion or both. It was smaller than she'd imagined from the 16 by 16 grid, roughly her height, roughly her mass. It stood with 2 of its limbs pressed against the transparent panel, the way a person presses their hand against glass when they see someone they've been waiting for. Marin pressed her own hand against the panel. The figure's surface colors rippled a cascade of amber to white to deep blue and back, cycling through a spectrum Marin couldn't read but could feel. The way she felt the signal that first night, the way she felt the mathematics underneath the static, the way she had felt at 3 in the morning on a cold mining platform on the dark side of Callisto, the universe reach out and touch her. The panel dissolved, not opened, not slid aside, dissolved, the material retracting into the walls like a membrane being reabsorbed until there was nothing between them but air. The being's limbs shifted, 2 of them extended toward Marin, not grasping, not reaching, offering. Open, flat, the undersides turned upward in a gesture that didn't require a dictionary. Marin extended her hand. The contact lasted less than a second. The texture was cool, smooth, with a faint vibration beneath the surface, a pulse, rhythmic, biological, a heartbeat, different from hers, faster, but there. The being's colors settled into a steady, warm amber. And from the portable terminal on Akafor's lap behind her, the decoder chimed once, soft and clear, as the being transmitted a final symbol into the bridge of language they had built together across 18 days and 400 light years. Marin didn't need to look at the screen. She already knew the word. It was the same word in both languages. The same word in every language that any thinking being had ever spoken, would ever speak in any medium, across any distance, in light or sound or mathematics, or the simple pressure of one hand against another. Welcome. The signal at 1427.3 MHz, 12 MHz above the hydrogen line, pulsed once more in the water hole. Then it went quiet, because there was nothing left to say that couldn't be said face to face. And in Lab 4 on the dark side of Callisto, where the coffee had gone cold for the last time, the waterfall display showed a flat line where the anomaly had been, and Dr. Marin Cole's empty chair sat in front of a console that still read FC 7741, because she had never been able to bring herself to write the words. She didn't need to anymore. The words had found her.